When Russia invaded Ukraine 1 year ago, in my view, there were three constants. One was that in a direct war between Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine would not win. The second constant was that Ukraine was fighting a war that was not its own. Russia was fighting NATO and not Ukraine, and Ukraine was fighting on behalf of NATO. The third constant was that a time would come when NATO and the European Union abandon Ukraine. As I speak today, and at the time of making this video, and at the time of engaging in this discussion, all these three constants had been revealed. I want to start with the first constant, which is the direct war between Russia and Ukraine would emerge a loser. We all know that Russia's military capability is incomparable with that of Ukraine. And in a case of a direct war between Ukraine and Russia, Russia would automatically win. Ukraine has stayed in this war with Russia because of the support it received from NATO and the European Union. In the case of a direct war between Russia and Ukraine, without any external support, Russia would easily win. Then I want to talk about this second constant, which is very, very important. I predicted, if you watch our discussions, past discussions, I predicted that a time will come when NATO and the European Union abandon Ukraine. And as we speak today, NATO members and the European Union have abandoned Ukraine. I stated the issue of Poland, which directly and openly stated that it would not supply weapons to Ukraine anymore. The same happens to other European unions. I stated the case of 5 European Union members and NATO members that emphasized their need to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine. Now, the main supplier of weapons, the main supplier of funds to Ukraine, the United States, has halted its obligation to support Ukraine in the war against Russia. Why am I saying this? Currently, the United States legislative houses are divided on whether to support or not to support Ukraine. There is a very hot topic, hot discussion, hot engagement ongoing in the US administration, in the US government. Currently, the Biden administration is considering stopping the supply of weapons and funding Ukraine war. You remember just recently, the US House Speaker was ousted simply because of the government support for the war between Russia and Ukraine. At the same time, Zelensky visited Washington with the request for the United States government to continue supplying Ukraine with weapons and funds to finance the war. And this request, in my view, was declined. This request evoked a lot of emotions from the representatives in the United States government. The current turmoil in the United States government is affecting the war in Ukraine. And what this communicates to Ukraine is simply, you are on your own. The United States and other NATO members and the European Union members are simply telling Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, that for now, you are on your own. The United States citizens are starting to question their government's involvement in Ukraine. United States representatives are starting to question their government's continued support for Ukraine. And the United States legislatures are saying enough is enough. I said in our past discussion that the United States has spent over 100 billion in Ukraine. It has spent over 100 billion in supporting Ukraine's war against Russia. And the legislature are now saying enough is enough. United States citizens are also saying enough is enough. The United States citizens are demanding accountability from their government. Accountability on how the war in Ukraine has been handled. They are demanding accountability to know how their government has spent in Ukraine. And they are demanding openness on their government's motive to support Ukraine in its war against Russia. In all these engagements, we would simply say that Russia has been fighting NATO and not Ukraine. You remember the engagement between Russia and NATO started sometimes back during the Cold War. The Cold War between Russia and Ukraine was mainly motivated by the desire by NATO to, let me say, to occupy Europe, to expand its territories in Europe. And NATO was committed to deter Russian influence in Europe. And by this, NATO and the United States committed to prevent Russia from acquiring more territories in Europe. And this has progressed until this time. You remember when Ukraine declared its interest to join NATO, Russia contested this move. Why? Because Ukraine joining NATO was simply saying that Russia was surrounded by NATO members. Russia was surrounded by the United States. The United States and NATO was committed to acquiring more territories around Russia. And this is what Russia considered a security threat. Russia saw the decision by NATO to convince Ukraine to join its membership as a threat to its national security. And according to the Russian government, this was a violation of several treaties that were signed before. What I am saying in this discussion is that currently Ukraine must understand that it is on its own. The United States, NATO members, the European Union have abandoned Ukraine. And it is time, I think it is time for Ukraine, the Ukrainian president, to declare ceasefire with Russia, because Ukraine doesn't stand a chance in a direct war with Russia. If the United States, if NATO, if the European Union withdraw from this war, then it will mean that it is Russia against Ukraine. And we know, and we must admit, that if it is a direct war between Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine will not win. And after all these processes, the primary victims of this engagement are innocent civilians in Ukraine and Russia. And the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, should not risk the lives of innocent civilians at the expense of fighting a war on behalf of NATO and the United States. NATO and the United States are pushing Ukraine to fight, knowing very well that Ukraine cannot win a war with Russia. Now they are telling Ukraine that you are on your own. We are withdrawing our military support. We are withdrawing our funds. Now it is Ukraine against Russia. And if an urgent intervention is not implemented, then more Ukrainian civilians will die. The NATO members, the US, European Union have withdrawn their support for Ukraine in this war. And it is time for Ukraine to consider a ceasefire, because more Ukrainians will die in this war. If this is not done, then more Ukrainians and more Russians will die. And I want to predict that soon and very soon, the United States, NATO members will publicly declare that they are withdrawing their support from Ukraine. Before this is done, and before more civilians die, I would advise the Ukrainian president, as I have always said, it is time to consider a ceasefire. It is time to engage the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. It is time to engage on a one-on-one talk with the Russian president to end this war.